Did you know that Evanescia parallels the Mongol Empire and its failed invasions of Japan? Behind Evanescia's happy-go-lucky facade is an ancient, primal, and violent side of her that she yields to when the planet of Elation calls for it, delivering her judgment to rule breakers of the Phantasmoon games at the sharp end of her blade. 4.2 reveals the truth to us about Evanescia, how she's the most resplendent branch of Yaoshi's garden, whisked away to Plain Arcadia by Aha to serve as the game's arbiter. On Plain Arcadia, she is an inescapable, undeniable power who's as magnificent as she is ephemeral, surging forward for only an instant during the games before falling into dormancy once more. Evanescia, with her abilities and ties to not one but two eons, represents a kind of sweeping, spiritually sanctioned force who takes Plain Arcadia by storm with her actions, mirroring both the Mongol Empire's unparalleled expansion across Eurasia as well as its two thwarted attempts to conquer Japan, which, after all, is what Plain Arcadia is based on. In this video, I'll be examining how both past and present Evanescia's story shares parallels with the largest land empire in history. Let's begin with who Evanescia once was, that most enchanting and luxuriant branch of Yaoshi's garden. More specifically, she was once the warrior leading her people in search of the abundance's gift of immortality, the only potential cure to their strange affliction that made them peak at youth, freeze, and suddenly reach old age. The first interesting detail about this past Evanescia is that she's said to have consumed the Crimson Moon, the very same plague mark of the Borson that Hule tore out of his chest and that Fei Xiao now possesses. The Crimson Moon originates from Verdantia, the Borson and Phoxian homeworld, and was a gift from Yaoshi to either the first Borson warhead Duran or the Phoxian lady Tu Shen, depending on which species myth you believe. This likely makes Evanescia herself either one of these species or of mixed heritage like Fei Xiao is. She is, after all,
a fox. A fox.
Back in the War Dance arc, we saw how the Crimson Moon distinctly affected both Borson and Phoxians. For the former, it's an intense surge in power, but for the latter, even mere exposure causes madness and a bestial transformation. It's not something any regular Phoxian can handle, let alone someone from beyond these two species. Of course, we don't officially know if her people were Phoxians, Borson, a mix of the two, or something else entirely, but it doesn't even matter either way. The Crimson Moon would have, by default, made her the de facto warhead of the Borson just by sheer status. The only way to get its immense gifts of strength and regeneration is to take it from the previous Borson warhead. Even if that past Evanescia didn't want to be warhead, the Borson would nevertheless recognize her as the strongest of the pack, like what Hule tells Fei Xiao as he forces the mantle onto her. This is not to mention that, unlike Fei Xiao, Evanescia had no reason to be enemies with the Borson as fellow Abundance Paths riders opposed to the Xianzhou, so it seems likely that she did actually lead them. This is Evanescia's first link to the Mongols, because the Borson as a species are chock full of references to them as well as various other Central Asian cultures. A first example is Fei Xiao's Borson name, Saran, which means moon in Mongolian in reference to both her moon rage and real Mongol women's names. Borson itself comes from the Turkic Böri, wolf, and is also similar to the name of Genghis Khan's clan, the Borjigin. Their mythical ancestry is said to have started with a blue-eyed wolf in a doe, which explains the lupine appearance of the Borson. The framework through which we interact with the Borson in the story is also important. It's mainly through the scope of the rivalry with the Xianzhou alliance, and thus analogizes the history of China's past dynasties and their constant conflicts with the nomadic nations on their border, most infamously of which was, of course, the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire is the second largest empire in history, only surpassed in size 6 centuries after its rise by the British. It was like nothing that came before. In 1206, the chieftain of the Borjigin clan united the disparate Mongol tribes and formally assumed the title Genghis Khan. For the next 5.5 decades, he and his successors conquered an empire spanning from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, from Syria to Siberia. Mongol forces were as brutal as they were innovative, simultaneously destroying civilizations and putting to death entire cities, whilst also continuously refining their martial and administrative ideology by incorporating the governors, generals, and engineers of the conquered lands to further their rule. The Mongol Empire introduced a system of tolerance that allowed people of all cultures and faiths to exist as long as they acknowledged that the Mongols sat at the top of the hierarchy as their overlords. Evanescia, as the most resplendent branch of the abundance, represents that same kind of unparalleled martial prowess and status. She was her people's sword singer who brutally cut through anyone in her wake, that golden-eyed beast who left only death in her wake. The real Evanescia behind the mask, at least according to Yao Guang. She was undefeated and proud without ever having to surrender, which matches up with Genghis Khan himself, who never directly lost a battle after taking that title. The two emanate the same kind of fatal, apocalyptic energy, a threat that would lay waste to you and all those around you if you got in their way. Mongol conquests were genuinely civilization-threatening calamities. Wherever they went and faced resistance, brutality on a mind-boggling scale was a constant. Here are a few examples that only really scratch the surface as to how destructive the Mongols were. The Western Xia in modern China had most of their population, ethnic Tungut people, massacred by the Mongols, leaving little trace of them in later history. Iran and Central Asia are said to have lost 3/4 of their people, with Iran only returning to its pre-Mongol population in the 20th century. The Abbasid Caliphate's capital of Baghdad with its grand libraries was sacked so harshly that the Tigris River ran red with blood and black with ink. Some 2,400 kilometers away, the old city and princedom of Ryazan in modern Russia was so totally destroyed that there were none left to even groan and cry. Overall, it's estimated that the Mongols caused around 50 million deaths during their conquests, at least 10% of the world population at the time, causing so much depopulation that the planet's carbon emissions actually lowered due to plants growing in newly deserted areas. Now, granted, we don't get nearly as many details about past Evanescia's deeds, but it's enough that Yao Guang, a centuries-old arbiter general, interprets the statement, most terrifying of horrors, to mean Evanescia herself. In the context of Star Ale, this would mean Evanescia was comparable to, if not even more dangerous than universe-threatening events like Iron Tomb, the Swarm Disaster, the Mechanical Emperor's Wars, and so on. Evanescia's reign of terror came to an end when she charged into Xianzhou territory and went face to face with none other than Marshal Hua, the Alliance's blazing phoenix, who handed Evanescia her first and only loss by the slimmest of margins. This defeat is presumably what sends her to Yaoshi's garden as a branch in stasis. The Mongols, despite their meteoric rise, proved just as fallible as Evanescia in the end, and were dealt their heaviest blow by an opponent strikingly similar to the Marshal. After the death of Münke Khan in 1259, the fourth Khan of the Mongols and Genghis's grandson, the empire fell into civil war before fracturing into 4 new Khanates: the Il Khanate in Iran, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and lastly the Yuan dynasty in East Asia. The ruler of Yuan was officially the Great Khan. He ruled over the Mongol homeland and was technically the other 3's superior, though this authority dwindled over time. Yuan rule over China lasted just under a century before it came crashing down during the Red Turban rebellions. The Red Turbans were a rebel movement that opposed Mongol rule. They initially operated covertly, secretly recruiting dissidents among disillusioned peasants. But in 1351 they took to armed rebellion, spreading like wildfire across northern China. Yuan troops responded harshly by indiscriminately destroying temples and monasteries that they suspected of having rebel sympathies. In 1352, Yuan soldiers burned down the monastery of one poor peasant, Zhu Yuanzheng, who then joined the Red Turbans and quickly ascended their ranks to become one of their most skilled commanders. He crushed Yuan and rival troops alike, leaving him as the prime candidate to establish a new empire in China. In 1368, after he took the Yuan capital of Dadu in modern Beijing and razed all the Mongol palaces to the ground, he then proclaimed the Ming dynasty as its Hongwu, or vastly martial, emperor. The remnants of Yuan retreated to the Mongol steppe, becoming the Northern Yuan, no longer a world-threatening power and relegated to their homeland, akin to Evanescia's own seclusion in Yaoshi's garden after her defeat. In other words, just as the Mongol Yuan were toppled by a fearsome Chinese general leader and greatly reduced in standing, so too was Evanescia by the general leader of the Xianzhou. Their enemies even share in their affinity for flames. Marshal Hua is described as a phoenix, a blaze, an encroaching wildfire that consumes her foes like dry leaves. Zhu Yuanzheng was equally famous for his use of fire ships in one of the most important battles of his campaign to unite China. At the Battle of Lake Poyang in 1363, he faced off against his arch-rival Chen Youliang and was initially losing the 4-day-long battle. On the third day, however, he unleashed an arsenal of fire bombs, fire guns, fire arrows, fire grenades, fire lances, fire tubes, and rockets onto his enemy's fleet, annihilating it in a decisive victory that paved the way for the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. Now, let's talk about what happens to Evanescia after her defeat. The moment Aha sneaks into Yaoshi's garden and kidnaps her, Aha decides to turn the Abundance's warlord into the Phantasmoon's guardian, someone immersed in the Elation, who, rather than desperately chasing immortality with death hot on her heels, would instead revel in the fleeting joys of humanity's finite life. It's a ridiculous turn of events to begin with. Planting a branch of the Abundance would be an apocalyptic event for many worlds and enough for the Xianzhou to invoke Lan's arrow. But to choose the most dangerous branch to serve the Elation is ludicrous on a whole other level, something that Aha even acknowledged to Evanescia. It's absurd to the point of disbelief, and is paralleled by the way the attempted Mongol invasions of Japan played out. In 1266, after the fracturing of the Mongol Khanates, Kublai Khan, ruler of Yuan and Genghis's grandson, dispatched Mongol and Korean envoys to the Kamakura shogunate in Japan to demand its submission to Mongol rule. The envoys were understandably mistreated once they arrived there, barred from entering Kamakura city, and forced to stay in a regular inn rather than official accommodations. One of the envoys' complaints was, funnily enough, the lack of proper manners and entertainment from the Japanese, the same party whose surrender they were demanding. Kublai Khan tried again for the next few years, with each envoy receiving no answer from Japan. Though the Japanese emperor wished to reply, the ruling shogun, Hojo Tokimune, overturned this. Sensing the way the wind was blowing, he instead began making preparations against a possible invasion which, indeed, was being prepared in Yuan lands. In 1274, a massive Yuan invasion fleet set off from the Korean port of Maasan and landed on several Japanese islands before reaching the mainland in Hakata Bay. The two sides only briefly clashed before the Yuan retreated into their ships for the night. The next day, the Japanese defenders were stunned to find that most of the ships had disappeared. It was rumored that a storm had suddenly blown through and destroyed much of the enemy, with only around half of the invasion forces retreating to Korea. Just 1 year later, Kublai Khan sent yet another envoy to the Japanese, but this time Tokimune ordered their execution, setting the stage for a second invasion in 1281. This one was even bigger than the last, as the largest naval invasion in recorded history until the D-Day landings during World War II. Once more, Mongol ships set sail from China and Korea and landed in Hakata Bay, finding it far more fortified than last time. The Mongols were unable to make a proper beachhead, but the Japanese forces could not dislodge their ships either, forcing a stalemate that lasted over a month. On August 15th, however, a great storm, a typhoon, struck the Mongol fleet once again, sealing the deal on the second invasion. Only around 20% of their troops survived, as Japanese samurai spared no one except the southern Chinese, because they'd only recently been conquered by the Yuan and it was felt they'd been forced to fight. In Japan, the two storms that had devastated the Mongol fleet became mythologized as kamikaze, literally meaning divine wind, partly because the alleged storm during the first invasion happened in November, well outside of Japan's rainy season. What was a violent natural phenomena was thus glorified as Japan's savior, instilling a belief that the kamikaze would protect Japan from defeat no matter how fearsome the enemy. The term was, for this reason, later co-opted during World War II as the name for the Japanese pilots who intentionally crashed their planes into Allied ships. Evanescia's role in Plain Arcadia aligns entirely with the kamikaze myth. First of all, in-universe, her intervention into the games would have that same spiritual connotation, given that she's born out of the intersection of two eons' powers. Second is her actual duty. Her mandate is to make sure that no one obstructs the Phantasmoon games from taking place, which is relatively simple if you think about it. There's no rules about fair play, stopping other paths from manipulating the elation or protection of innocence. All that matters is that the games, the very essence of the planet of elation, go on. In the same vein, a storm is, Well, a storm, a natural occurrence that bears no regard for the settlements it destroys, the lives it claims, or the lives it saves. Even as a mythologized kamikaze, its sole purpose was to ensure that Japan simply continued to exist. It had no say on the form Japan took as a nation, whether it was a feudal state of warring samurai, a westernizing imperial power, or a techno-corporate consumerist society. That was all for the inhabitants to decide, just like in plain Arcadia. This is why Yaguang tells Evanescia that the Tamagotchi-toting fluffy fanatic that we get to know is the mask, and that her fierce, golden-eyed self is who she truly is. A force of nature, a self-described bigger threat who scars the land when she intervenes, but who otherwise only sporadically interacts with the mortal realm. Evanescia can't do more than look down from on high at the world she's so desperate to get to know, seeing the human experience, its joys, tragedies, and sufferings pass by her, a spectator behind a veil. She admits as much when she says that it pained her to powerlessly witness the massacre during the last Phantasmoon games, though in 4.2 she does finally break from this passivity. This is part of the native Japanese Shinto belief as well, that the kami weren't inherently visible to humanity, but instead belonged to a specific place and time and only interacted with people in set contexts with set duties, exactly like Evanescia. This brings me to Evanescia's visual presentation. First of all, her ultimate animation is a literal kamikaze, a tornado cast to deliver her arbitration on those who threaten the games. The location she's tied to is, of course, the Phantasmoon Courtyard and the Ambrosial Arbour, the Panarch Elwood that she's the literal embodiment of. The Courtyard is undoubtedly the most mysterious and bizarre area we've come across in plain Arcadia. As far as I can tell, it might just straight up be on the Phantasmoon given that it's not visible from the Courtyard itself, and the only way to get there currently is through a painting. It's also very rustic, not at all like the extremely urbanized rest of the planet. Believe it or not, this entire courtyard has heavy parallels to the Mongol Empire. First of all is the tree itself. It's, of course, in-universe a reference to the abundance as a ginkgo tree, which historically has represented vitality and longevity across East Asia, in line with the abundance's theme of immortality. Besides that, ginkgos are frequently found in Shinto shrines in Japan as shelters for local spirits, which, of course, the tree is in this case for Evanescia. Other than this direct symbolism, however, consider what it represents narratively. A fundamentally foreign, potentially destructive influence at the heart of the courtyard and, in some sense, at the heart of the planet itself. It's a massive, imposing testament to Evanescia's power, something that's reflected in the real-world courtyard of the Mongol Empire's capital of Karakorum. Located in central Mongolia, Karakorum was little more than a small town that was elevated into the Mongol Empire's center of power. People from across Eurasia ended up there as the city grew into a cosmopolitan testament to the Mongol Khan's global status. To honor the Khan's prestige was thus commissioned a fitting monument in Karakorum's palatial courtyard. Designed by an enslaved French goldsmith was a massive tree made out of silver and other rare metals, taller than the palace itself. Braided around its branches were golden serpents, and atop it was a mechanical angel with a trumpet that sounded when the Khan wished to entertain guests, at which point the serpents spilled drink into a silver basin below. A shocking amount of these details relate to Evanescia. Like the enslaved designer of the tree, she too remains captive to her duties on plain Arcadia. Like the silver tree's ornaments, she too only briefly comes alive for entertainment's sake, the Phantasmoon games. And the tree does also sit in its own basin of water. The imagery of Sunday's bird quietly sitting on the tree's branch is also akin to the angel in its trumpet. And of course the arbor's grayish gold colors are like the Mongol one too. Now, as for the courtyard itself, I already mentioned how different it looks from the rest of plain Arcadia. A potential explanation lies in the etymology of the word Karakorum. It's derived from Turkic languages and means black gravel or soot. Though I'm no geologist, the ground in the Phantasmoon courtyard looks remarkably similar to that description, and given that it's found nowhere else in plain Arcadia, is another indicator of both Evanescia and the tree's foreignness. Now, Evanescia is far from a static character. A lot of these references lie in her past life and new beginnings in plain Arcadia. Since then, she's taken root on the planet of Elation. Like the Mongols who incorporated everything useful in war and governance from their subjects, she's continuously adapted to match the Japanese-inspired culture of her adopted homeland. Whether this means donning a schoolgirl's uniform to fit in, transforming her best friend Master Fox into a Tamagotchi, or becoming a niche media creator. The fundamental irony of her character, however, is that though she'll eternally witness the human world change beneath her, all she can do herself is occasionally react to it with these adaptations, never being able to truly partake in it. Of course, these Phantasmoon games have been very different. Her fate is up in the air this time. Not only has she somehow been entered into the games as a supplicant and also gifted us our own mask, but she deliberately broke her own rules of non-intervention by healing the victims of Full Wish's scheme. As always, the Trailblaze's arrival brings change and choice for its destination's inhabitants. No doubt the same will be true for Evanescia, and I'm excited to see where Starl takes the story of Plain Arcadia's silliest warlord next. That's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below your thoughts. This was without a doubt one of my favorite cooks so far, and more Starl content is soon to come. Alright, take it easy and until next time.